The Jeffrey Dahmer case, the cannibal who terrified the nation. Chapter 1. The Apartment of Whispers. In the humid summer of 1991, in the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, there was an apartment building like any other, the Oxford Apartments on North 25th Street. It held the quiet, anonymous lives of its tenants. But behind the door of apartment 213, a silence was being kept. A silence so profound it was a sound in itself, composed of secrets, decay, and a loneliness that had curdled into an unspeakable horror. This is not the story of a phantom who hunted across states. It is the story of a black hole, a man who drew his victims into his own small, terrifying universe, from which they would never escape. On the night of July 22nd, that silence was shattered. When police officers entered the apartment of a quiet, unassuming 31-year-old man named Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, they were prepared for a routine assault investigation. They were not prepared for the abyss that awaited them. What they found would not just shock a city, but would sear itself into the global consciousness, redefining the very meaning of monstrous. Polaroids of dismembered bodies, human heads in the refrigerator, a vat of acid in the corner, a human heart in the freezer. The apartment was not a home. It was a mausoleum. The name Jeffrey Dahmer became synonymous with the darkest taboos of human behavior, necrophilia, cannibalism, and the methodical deconstruction of human beings. His story has been told and retold, most recently in the widely watched Netflix series, Dahmer Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story, forcing a new generation to confront the unnerving quietness of his evil. He was not a charming manipulator who blended in with high society. He was a ghost, a shy, awkward man who haunted the fringes, so desperate to keep someone with him that he would destroy them to do so. Our journey is not into the mind of a predator who enjoyed the chase, but into the void of a man who feared being left alone more than he feared anything else. We will explore how a seemingly normal boy from a suburban Ohio home became the architect of one of the most gruesome crime scenes in American history. We will not look for a devil, but for the broken human machinery that allowed such horrors to be enacted. How does a man's loneliness become so absolute that the dead offer better company than the living? The answer begins in the deafening silence of a child's bedroom. Chapter 2. The Boy with the Bones. To understand the man who collected skulls in his apartment, one must first meet the boy who collected animal bones in the woods. Jeffrey Dahmer was born in 1960 and grew up in a comfortable, middle-class home in Bath, Ohio. The landscape of his childhood was one of manicured lawns, leafy trees, and the deceptive tranquility of American suburbia. On the surface, it was an idyllic setting, but inside the Dahmer home, fractures were forming. His father, Lionel, a research chemist, was often absent both physically and emotionally, consumed by his academic work. His mother, Joyce, struggled with her mental health, prone to depression, anxiety, and hypochondria, which created a tense and unpredictable atmosphere in the home. Young Jeffrey was a quiet and withdrawn child, left largely to his own devices. While other boys played with trucks and baseballs, Jeffrey developed a solitary, secret hobby. He became fascinated by the creatures he found on the side of the road. He would collect roadkill, squirrels, birds, chipmunks, and take them into the woods behind his house. There he created a private laboratory. He would carefully dissect the animals, examining their internal structures. He used chemicals from his father's garage to dissolve their flesh, leaving only the clean white bones, which he would meticulously reassemble. This was not the cruel act of a boy who enjoyed inflicting pain. It was the detached curiosity of a young scientist exploring the mechanics of life and death. Alone, this fascination with anatomy and preservation was an early sign of a mind grappling with themes of control and permanence. In a home life that felt chaotic and unstable, the predictable, unchanging nature of a skeleton offered a strange kind of comfort. He could take something apart and put it back together. He was in complete control. As he entered adolescence, this isolation deepened. He felt disconnected from his peers, socially awkward, and increasingly aware of his homosexual urges, which he viewed with shame and confusion. In the conservative climate of the 1970s, the silence of the woods, the click of bone against bone, the chemical smells, these became the sensory landscape of his inner world. He was building a fortress of solitude, not out of malice, but out of a profound inability to connect with the living world around him. He was a ghost in his own life, long before he started creating ghosts of his own. The groundwork was being laid not for a killer, but for something arguably more terrifying, a collector. The first and most critical component of the monster was already in place, a soul-crushing loneliness. Chapter 3. The Point of No Return. High school is a stage for social performance, but for Jeffrey Dahmer, it was a showcase of his profound alienation. Unable to form genuine connections, he adopted a bizarre persona. He became known for faking epileptic seizures, making strange noises in the hallways, and photobombing the school's honor society picture. This was the Do the Dahmer phase, a desperate, clumsy attempt to get any form of attention, even if it was negative. It was a performance of madness to mask a deep well of social anxiety and pain. Beneath this strange public display, his private world was darkening. He began drinking heavily, often showing up to class drunk, hiding liquor bottles in his locker. Alcohol became the fuel that quieted his anxieties and emboldened his burgeoning fantasies. The fantasies were becoming more specific, more demanding. They centered on a desire for a completely passive, compliant partner, someone who would never argue, never resist, and most importantly, never leave him. The living were too unpredictable. They had their own will, their own desires. In his mind, the perfect companion was one he could control completely, an object for his affection, a permanent fixture in his lonely life. This chilling logic was taking root, watered by alcohol and isolation. The summer of 1978 was a turning point. He was 18 years old. His parents had just gone through a bitter divorce, and he was living alone in the family house. The fantasies demanded to be made real. On June 18th, Dahmer picked up a young hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. He brought him back to the house with the promise of beer and music. For a few hours, it was a fleeting moment of companionship. But when Hicks said he wanted to leave, the primal fear of abandonment that defined Dahmer's existence took over. He couldn't let him go. In a sudden, impulsive act of violence, he struck Hicks from behind with a barbell, killing him. The threshold had been crossed. The boy who collected animal bones had now collected a human life. The act was followed by a frantic, methodical effort to erase what he had done. He dismembered the body in the crawl space, dissolving parts in acid and burying the rest in the woods behind the house. The fantasies were no longer just fantasies. He had discovered that he could, through violence, make them a reality. He had created his first permanent companion. The 9-year gap before his next murder was not a period of remorse, but one of suppression, a long, simmering struggle with the monster he now knew lived inside him. But the gate had been opened, and it was only a matter of time before he walked through it again. Chapter 4. The Laboratory of Loneliness. To understand the horror of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes, one must understand their purpose. They were not born of sadistic rage in the way we often imagine. They were the result of a pathological, twisted pursuit of an end to his loneliness. His modus operandi was a grotesque scientific method aimed at creating the perfect, non-responsive partner. His hunting ground was the gay bar scene of Milwaukee, places where he could find men who, like him, were often on the fringes of society, whose disappearance might not be immediately noticed. He would use his quiet, non-threatening demeanor to lure them back to his apartment with promises of money for photographs or simply for a drink. Once inside the suffocating confines of apartment 213, the true experiment would begin. The first step was to incapacitate his victims. He would drug their drinks with sleeping pills, rendering them unconscious. This was the moment of total control he craved. In these quiet, horrifying hours, he would often photograph them, preserving the image of the passive companion he so desperately wanted. But unconsciousness was temporary. People wake up, they leave. And for Dahmer, being left was the one thing he could not bear. This fear led him to the most infamous aspect of his crimes, the gruesome experiments to create a living zombie. He believed that if he could destroy the part of the brain that controlled the will, he could create a partner who would be alive but completely subservient to him. He would drill holes into his victims' skulls and pour in muriatic acid or boiling water. These horrific acts were not acts of torture for the sake of pain. In his warped mind, they were a form of creation, a surgical procedure to cure his isolation. They always failed. The victim would inevitably die, and Dahmer would be left alone once again with a body. The dismemberment that followed was a practical matter. It was a way to dispose of the evidence, but it was also an extension of his childhood fascination with anatomy. He would methodically take the bodies apart in his bathtub, keeping certain parts as trophies, skulls, which he sometimes painted, skeletons and organs. The cannibalism was the final, most disturbing act of possession. By consuming parts of his victims, he felt he could make them a literal part of him, ensuring they would never truly be gone. His apartment was not a torture chamber. It was a laboratory of loneliness, a workshop where a broken man used human beings as raw materials in a failed, horrifying attempt to build himself a friend. Chapter 5. The Unveiling of the Abyss. When the full reality of what lay inside apartment 213 was revealed to the public, the reaction was not just shock. It was a visceral, nationwide shudder of revulsion. The details that emerged in the days and weeks after Dahmer's arrest on July 22, 1991, were the stuff of nightmares given flesh. News reports painted a surreal and gruesome picture, a blue 57-gallon drum filled with acid and decomposing bodies, severed heads stored matter-of-factly next to food in the refrigerator, meticulously cleaned skulls lining shelves. The sheer banality of the setting, a cheap, ordinary apartment, made the horror all the more potent. This wasn't a Gothic castle. It was the apartment next door. The nation was captivated and horrified in equal measure. Dahmer's name became a household word overnight, a new benchmark for human depravity. The media frenzy was instantaneous and all-consuming. Television screens were filled with images of the unassuming, bespectacled killer and the grim facade of the Oxford apartments. People struggled to comprehend the psychology behind the acts. Cannibalism and necrophilia were concepts so far outside the realm of normal human experience that Dahmer seemed almost like a creature from another species. This case tapped into a deep, primal fear of what can fester behind a quiet neighbor's closed door. For the community in Milwaukee, the reaction was more complex, layered with anger and a profound sense of betrayal. A pattern quickly emerged among the victims. Most were men of color, Black, Hispanic, and Asian. For years, families and community leaders had been reporting their sons, brothers and friends missing, only to be met with indifference or inaction by the police. The LGBTQ+ community, already battling prejudice and the AIDS crisis, felt that the disappearances from gay bars were not taken seriously. Dahmer's crimes didn't just unveil the abyss of one man's mind. They threw a harsh spotlight on the systemic racism and homophobia that had allowed him to hunt with impunity for so long. The public outcry was not just against Dahmer, but against the institutions that had failed to stop him. The question on everyone's lips was not just, how could he do this? But how was he allowed to do this for so long? The emotions were a volatile mix of grief for the victims, disgust at the crimes, and rage at the perceived failures of the system designed to protect them. The nation was forced to look at itself in a fractured mirror, and the reflection it saw was deeply unsettling. The horror of the crimes was matched. only by the shame of the opportunities missed to prevent. Chapter 6, A Trail of Missed Opportunities, the story of the hunt for Jeffrey Dahmer, is not a story of brilliant detective work. It is a chilling chronicle of institutional failure, a series of missed signals and catastrophic errors in judgment that allowed a killer to operate in plain sight. Long before the final discovery, the Milwaukee police had Dahmer, quite literally, in their hands. The most damning of these encounters occurred on the night of May 27, 1991, just 2 months before his capture. 2 black women, Glenda Cleveland's daughter and niece, found a dazed and naked boy wandering on the street. He was bleeding, incoherent, and clearly in distress. They called the police for help. When the officers arrived, Dahmer appeared on the scene. Calmly and convincingly, he explained that the boy was his 19-year-old lover, that they had had an argument, and that he was simply drunk. The boy was, in fact, 14-year-old Konorak Synthesomphone. Despite the women's frantic pleas that the child was in danger, and despite the obvious evidence that something was terribly wrong, the officers believed Dahmer. They perceived it as a domestic dispute between 2 gay men and chose not to interfere further. They helped Dahmer walk the drugged, terrified teenager back into apartment 213. The officers even joked about needing to be deloused after the encounter. Inside, Konorak Synthesomphone was murdered. This incident was not an isolated case. Dahmer had a criminal record, including a conviction for sexual assault of Konorak's older brother years earlier in Ohio. He was on probation at the time of his Milwaukee murders. Neighbors had complained for months about the horrific putrid smells emanating from his apartment, smells they likened to rotting meat. They called the building manager and even the police, but their complaints were dismissed as trivial. Dahmer would explain the smell away as spoiled meat from a broken freezer. No one ever thought to look inside. These failures were not simply bad luck. They were a product of systemic biases. The victims were gay men of color, populations often marginalized and dismissed by law enforcement at the time. The witnesses who tried to save Konorak were black women, whose testimony was ignored in favor of the calm, plausible lies of a white man. The investigation, in the end, was not an investigation of Dahmer, but an investigation by him. He was the one who had to make a mistake. It was only when his final intended victim, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape and flag down police that the House of Horrors was finally breached. The truth is a bitter pill. The monster wasn't caught. He was revealed long after the system had looked the other way. Chapter 7. The Trial of Sanity. The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer, which began in January 1992, was not about guilt or innocence. He had already confessed to the killings in exhaustive detail. The central question that captivated the televised proceedings was much more fundamental. Was he sane? The courtroom became a theater for a debate on the nature of evil itself. Was Dahmer a man who chose to commit these acts? Or was he a helpless passenger driven by mental compulsions so powerful they eclipsed his sense of right and wrong? The prosecution and the defense painted 2 vastly different portraits of the man sitting silently at the table. The defense argued that Dahmer was legally insane, a victim of a series of mental illnesses, including necrophilia, which they framed as a clinical disorder that compelled him to commit his acts. They presented a narrative of a man so consumed by his twisted need to create a permanent, zombie-like companion that he was no longer in control of his actions. Their star witness, a psychiatrist, testified that Dahmer was in a psychotic state during the murders, unable to conform his conduct to the law. They argued that his actions were not the product of a criminal mind, but of a deeply sick one. The prosecution countered with a simpler, more chilling narrative. Jeffrey Dahmer was sane, methodical, and unequivocally evil. They pointed to the careful, calculated steps he took to avoid detection. He drugged his victims to keep them quiet. He dismembered their bodies to dispose of them. He used bleach and other chemicals to clean his apartment and mask the evidence. These, they argued, were not the actions of a man detached from reality. They were the actions of a criminal who knew exactly what he was doing and understood that it was wrong. They presented evidence that Dahmer was able to control his urges when the risk of getting caught was high, proving he had the capacity for choice. Throughout the trial, Dahmer himself was a placid, almost invisible presence. Heavily medicated, he sat impassively, rarely showing emotion, even as the gut-wrenching details of his crimes were recounted. The most dramatic moments came from the families of the victims. Their cries of grief and rage echoed through the courtroom, a raw and painful reminder of the human cost of the clinical debate taking place. On February 15, 1992, the jury delivered its verdict. They found Jeffrey Dahmer to be legally sane on 15 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms. The law had rendered its judgment, but the deeper question of what truly drove the man in apartment 213 would linger long after the courtroom doors were closed. Chapter 8. A Caged Confession. For Jeffrey Dahmer, life in the Columbia Correctional Institution was a stark contrast to the secret, solitary world he had built for himself. Stripped of his autonomy, he became an object of intense scrutiny, a living specimen of human pathology. His time in prison was marked by a series of high-profile interviews, most notably with his own father Lionel and with journalists, where he spoke about his crimes with a chilling, analytical detachment. He did not offer excuses in the traditional sense, but he did offer explanations, tracing his actions back to the obsessive thoughts and overwhelming loneliness that had plagued him since childhood. He described his compulsion as a relentless downward spiral. It started with fantasies, which then required alcohol to manage, and eventually the fantasies demanded to be acted upon. He spoke of his victims not with hatred, but with a terrifying objectification. They were instruments in his obsessive quest to create a companion who would not leave him. When asked if he felt remorse, his answers were often clinical. He understood intellectually that what he did was wrong and caused immense pain to the victims' families. He could articulate the moral and legal failure, but whether he could truly feel their pain on an empathetic level remains a deeply ambiguous question. His regret seemed centered on his own brokenness and his inability to control the part of me that was doing these things. In a move that surprised many, Dahmer was baptized in prison in May 1994, embracing Christianity. He told interviewers that he believed in God and hell, and that he deserved whatever punishment awaited him. For some, this was a sign of a man genuinely seeking redemption. For others, it was simply the final chapter in the life of a man who had always sought structure and a way to make sense of the chaos within him. Whether through dissecting animals, building shrines of bones, or embracing religious dogma, his life behind bars was not destined to be long. Many inmates saw him as the ultimate monster, and his presence created constant tension. Despite being kept in protective custody for much of his sentence, he was eventually allowed more interaction with the general population. On the morning of November 28, 1994, while on a work detail cleaning a prison gymnasium, Dahmer was attacked and beaten to death by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver. He was 34 years old. The man who had spent his life desperately trying to prevent people from leaving him had finally, permanently, been left alone in death. Chapter 9. The Mind of the Collector. To dissect the mind of Jeffrey Dahmer is to explore a unique and terrifying corner of criminal psychology. Unlike a classic psychopath like Ted Bundy, who was driven by grandiosity, contempt, and a sadistic need for power over others, Dahmer's motivations were rooted in something far more pathetic and inwardly focused, a pathological fear of abandonment and an all-consuming loneliness. The psychological consensus points toward a constellation of severe personality disorders, including schizotypal, borderline, and paranoid personality disorders. Layered over with paraphilias like necrophilia, his primary driver was the desperate need to create a permanent, controllable companion. This is the core of borderline personality disorder, a frantic effort to avoid real or imagined abandonment. For Dahmer, this fear was so extreme that he could not tolerate the independent will of another human being. A living person could always choose to leave. Therefore, in his twisted logic, he had to transform them into an object, a thing he could possess completely and eternally. His murders were not the end goal. They were a failed step in this process. The true goal was the creation of a shrine of skulls and bones, a permanent collection of companions who would surround him in his solitude. His schizotypal traits were evident in his profound social anxiety, his odd or eccentric behavior, and his preference for solitary activities. He lived more in his internal fantasy world than in external reality. This detachment allowed him to view other people not as individuals with thoughts and feelings, but as raw materials for his projects. He didn't dehumanize them as an act of cruelty. He simply never fully humanized them in the first place. They were, to his mind, beautiful objects that he wanted to keep. This separates him from the manipulative charm of the antisocial psychopath. Dahmer was not a performer. He was awkward, shy, and transparently strange. His evil was not hidden behind a mask of sanity. It was the product of a mind that was fundamentally broken, unable to form the basic human connections that anchor the rest of us to reality. He was not a wolf in sheep's clothing. He was a ghost, haunting the edges of the world, driven by a need so profound and so warped that it led him to build a kingdom of the dead to cure the emptiness inside him. Chapter 10. The Emptiness That Consumes. The Legacy of Jeffrey. Dahmer is not one of terrifying charisma, but of a terrifying void. He holds a unique place in the grim pantheon of serial killers because he forces us to confront a different kind of monster. He was not the predator who walks among us with a charming smile, but the quiet neighbor whose profound isolation festered into a private universe of horror. His story is a chilling testament to what can happen when human loneliness reaches its most pathological extreme, when the need for connection becomes so distorted that it can only be satisfied through control, possession, and ultimately, consumption. His case peeled back a layer of society to reveal the people who fall through the cracks, both the victims he targeted and the killer himself. He operated in a world of benign neglect, where the complaints of neighbors were ignored and the disappearance of marginalized men was not prioritized. The horror of his apartment was not just the physical evidence, but the fact that it could exist undiscovered for so long. He is a reminder that the most dangerous places are not always dark alleys, but the quiet rooms where forgotten people sit alone with their obsessions. As we close this file, the silence that surrounds the Dahmer case feels different. It is the silence of absence, of emptiness. It leaves us with questions that are deeply uncomfortable. What is the line between profound mental illness and calculated evil? Dahmer knew his actions were wrong by society's standards, yet he felt pathologically compelled to commit them. He was judged sane by the law, but his mind was clearly a wasteland of disordered thinking and broken emotional circuits. This raises a final, haunting question. Are monsters like Jeffrey Dahmer born from a void that exists within them from the start? Or are they carved out piece by piece by the voids we leave around them in the world? The voids of neglect, of indifference, and of failed human connection. If this story has intrigued you, subscribe to the channel to explore other true crimes that have shocked the world and the minds behind them.